The bar was filled with the soft hum of conversation and the gentle sounds of jazz. Anthony opened the door, holding it open for his wife, Claire. She entered first, and his hand, resting habitually on her waist, slipped for a moment while he watched her elegant black dress gently envelop her figure. She looked amazing, and Anthony noticed that he wasn't the only one who noticed it. The party was held at their friend Nick's favorite place in a small but elegant bar with dim lighting, expensive cocktails and a slight touch of snobbery. You couldn't just be yourself here, you had to be the best version of yourself, and this place seemed to reflect Nick himself, charismatic, self-confident, and a little narcissistic. Nick has been Anthony's best friend since his student days. He knew how to charm people and was always the center of attention. Today was his birthday and he invited close friends to his favorite bar, a place with dim lights, jazz music and an impressive selection of drinks. Nick's wife was not at the party. She was on a business trip and was due to return only in a few days. Anthony always admired how Nick and Stephanie seemed to be a harmonious couple, although his friend often complained about her constant trips. Nick was sitting in the corner at a round table with a couple of friends. When he saw them, his loud laughter suddenly died down, as if he had just told a joke but had lost interest in his own wit. A smile stretched across his face, but his gaze settled on Claire, not Anthony. "Claire!" Nick exclaimed, getting up from his chair. He walked towards her with quick steps. His movements seemed too hasty to be just polite. "You look..." He looked her up and down, not hiding his appreciation. "Just incredible." Before Anthony could say anything, Nick wrapped his arms around Claire, lifting her easily off the floor. She screamed in surprise and laughed, but Anthony caught in her laughter not only joy, but also a slight embarrassment. "Nick, you're being dramatic as always," she said, pulling back slightly, but the smile was still on her lips. Anthony stood next to her, feeling how his hand, which had previously been on his wife's waist, now hung uselessly by her side. When Nick finally turned to him, his expression had changed. The handshake Anthony received was so weak that it felt more like a formality than a meeting of old friends. "Come on, sit down," Nick said, gesturing them over to the table. "Everything is just beginning here." Claire took Anthony's hand as if she could feel his tension. Her fingers were soft, but her touch wasn't soothing. They walked over to a table where several of Nick's friends were already sitting. They were all smiling, but Anthony caught a couple of strange glances. One of the men whispered something to his neighbor, who laughed softly, glancing briefly at Claire. Anthony clenched his teeth but decided to ignore it. They sat down and Anthony ordered himself a scotch. Claire took a martini. Nick seemed to have completely turned his attention to Claire, telling her some stories and making her laugh. It was a laugh that sounded too easy, too open, as if for someone else. Nick leaned closer to Claire, his elbow lightly touching her arm. Anthony sat across from her and watched, trying to keep a neutral expression on his face, even though he didn't understand what was going on. He drank his scotch in one gulp, feeling the hot wave of alcohol spreading inside, but it didn't calm his growing anxiety. "Anthony, are you okay?" Nick finally addressed him, but his tone was more polite than interested. "It's okay, friend," Anthony replied shortly. His voice sounded a little sharper than he intended. He added, "It's a great evening." Nick nodded, but he was already looking past him as if the conversation was over. Claire didn't seem to notice the changes in the atmosphere. She sat with her head slightly tilted, listening to Nick, her hair streaming over her shoulders, catching the light from the lamp above the table. She looked completely relaxed, and Anthony felt like a tightrope about to snap. "I'll be right back," Anthony said, getting up. He felt the need to leave at least for a couple of minutes. Standing up, he glanced at Claire, but her attention was focused on Nick. Entering the bathroom, Anthony leaned against the sink, looking at his reflection in the mirror. His face was pale and his jaw was clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. He turned on the water and splashed cold water on his face. Something was wrong and he knew it. But what exactly? He couldn't figure out if he was really seeing signs of something real, or if it was just paranoia. Returning to the table, Anthony felt his steps grow heavier, as if each step was accompanied by a weighty, strange premonition. Scenes from the first few minutes of the evening came back to my mind. Nick's indifference, his warm, even too welcoming smile for Claire. Something didn't fit into the usual pattern of their communication. As Anthony got closer, his heart began to ache from what he saw. Nick was standing next to Claire, staying too close. His hand rested unobtrusively on the back of her chair, and his tilted head betrayed an intimacy that could not be explained by a simple friendly conversation. Claire was laughing loudly and openly as if Nick had just told her the wittiest joke. Anthony sat back down, trying to look unperturbed, but inside, his thoughts were spinning like a whirlwind. He picked up his glass and took a sip, carefully watching Nick's every move. Was it just friendly fun? Or did he see more than he should have? Anthony, you look so serious, Claire's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. She turned to him, but her gaze was somehow distracted, as if she was there with her body but not with her soul. It's okay, he replied with a shrug. I'm just thinking about work. He knew it was a weak excuse, but he didn't want to bring up the conversation here among outsiders. Claire seemed to take his words at face value, turning her attention back to Nick, who was already telling another story, gesturing to emphasize its drama. Anthony noticed how their table became the center of attention. Two men at the next table cast brief glances in the direction of Claire and Nick, talking to each other with slight grins. One of them even laughed softly, leaning towards his companion. Anthony clenched his jaw, feeling an unpleasant rush of heat to his face. He turned to Claire, hoping to meet her gaze, but she was looking at Nick again, her hand lightly touching his elbow, as if it were a perfectly natural gesture. Let's make another toast, Nick suggested, raising his glass. To Claire, who as always decorates any event. His words drew chuckles from the next table, and Claire blushed but smiled. She raised her glass in response, and their eyes met. Anthony noticed Nick's gaze lingering on her for a little longer than was strictly polite. When the general conversation had died down a bit, Anthony leaned closer to Claire and asked quietly, "Are you having a good time?" She turned to him with a smile. "And you?" "Great," he replied, but his words sounded almost sarcastic. She frowned slightly but said nothing, turning her attention back to Nick, who had already entered into a new conversation with the rest of the guests. Anthony felt his patience wear thin. He got up to get another drink. Anthony felt his chest tighten. He picked up his glass, trying to ignore the anger rising inside. When he returned to the table, Claire and Nick were gone. His gaze darted around the bar until he found them in the corner by the counter. They were standing too close to each other, their laughter sounding too loud, as if the world around them didn't exist. Anthony walked up to them, his heart pounding like a hammer. "Is everything okay?" His voice was flat, but his eyes were intense. Claire turned to him in mild surprise, as if she'd forgotten he was there. Nick didn't seem the least bit embarrassed. "Of course," she replied. Nick was just offering to try one of his favorite cocktails. "You should try it." Anthony nodded, but a picture was already forming in his mind. The evening wasn't over yet, but something inside him was already broken. They continued to talk, laughing at something she apparently found funny. Nick leaned closer, and his hand was on her elbow again. At that moment, Anthony's patience ran out. A strong sense of humiliation mixed with anger, which he could no longer contain. "Claire, can I talk to you for a minute?" Anthony's voice was a little louder than he had intended. The bar went quiet for a second as several people turned in their direction. She froze, looking at him in surprise. Nick turned around too, his face taking on a mocking expression for a moment. "Is everything okay?" Claire asked, her voice sounding almost innocent, but Anthony detected a slight nervousness in her tone. "We need to talk now." He gestured towards their table to make it clear that the discussion would be personal. She shot a quick glance at Nick, who just shrugged as if letting her go. The movement made Anthony grit his teeth. He turned around and headed for the table, confident that Claire would follow him. When they were alone, Anthony didn't delay. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was low, but it was trembling with suppressed anger. He leaned on the table, leaning closer to her. "Do you think I can't see anything?" What are you talking about?" Claire took a step back, her face a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "You're acting weird, Anthony." "Strange?" He laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "I'm watching my best friend flirt with my wife all evening, and you're saying that I'm the one acting weird? Are you out of your mind, Claire?" She frowned, her hands clasped nervously on her chest. "You've got it all wrong. It's just friendship. You know how Nick can be." "I know," Anthony interrupted, "and that's why I'm not going to stand for it. He acted like I wasn't welcome here. And you? You're acting like I'm invisible too." Her face flushed, but she quickly controlled herself. "That's ridiculous, Anthony. Nick is your friend. Are you jealous?" "It's just nothing." "It's nothing?" He stepped closer, his voice almost a whisper, but that only made it more threatening. "Maybe it's nothing. Is it his hand touching you? The look in his eyes when he talks to you? Or the fact that you laugh with him like a street girl?" Claire opened her mouth to reply, but suddenly stopped. Her gaze became distant, as if she was searching for the right words. "I don't want to continue this conversation here," she said, straightening up. "We'll discuss this at home." "No, we'll discuss it now," Anthony couldn't control himself anymore. His voice rose, attracting the attention of the people at the nearby tables. "Anthony, stop it," she whispered, grabbing his arm. Her gaze darted around and she was visibly nervous about being stared at. But he wasn't going to calm down. His senses were on edge. He wanted the truth here and now. "Stop it." He jerked his hand away. "Don't you understand that it looks like I'm an idiot who has to put up with all this? Do you think I can't see what's going on under my nose?" Claire blushed, her lips trembled, but she didn't say anything. At that moment, Nick came up to them trying to intervene. "Hey Anthony, relax," he said with a casual smile. "You've got it all wrong. We were just talking." Anthony turned to him and his anger shifted to his friend. "Just talking? Is that what you call simple?" His voice was louder than he wanted it to be. "Do you think I didn't see what you were doing? You've been flirting with my wife all evening. You're going crazy, buddy." Nick pursed his lips, still trying to look calm. "Maybe you just need to cool off." "Cool off?" Anthony almost laughed with rage. "You're courting my wife, you're laughing at me all evening, and now you're telling me to calm down?" At that moment, Claire stepped between them. "That's enough." Her voice was shaking. "Anthony, please let's talk at home." "Yes, at home," he said, his gaze steady. "Because I'm not going to pretend that nothing is happening anymore. Go." Without waiting for her answer, he turned around and walked to the exit. Claire froze for a moment, then followed him, trying not to look at the guests who were openly watching what was happening. When they entered the house and the door slammed shut behind them, Anthony turned abruptly to Claire. "Show me your phone." His voice was firm, but there was anger in his eyes. Claire recoiled. "Are you kidding?" "What is it?" she asked. "I am absolutely serious. Show me. If I have nothing to fear, you have nothing to hide." She froze, her hands shaking. Then, as if making up her mind, she pulled the phone out of her bag and handed it to him. Anthony grabbed it, quickly scanning through the screen. A few minutes later, he found what he had been dreading: messages between Claire and Nick. The texts were innocent at first glance, but the subtext was obvious. One message stood out in particular. "You were great today. I can hardly wait for the next time." He silently looked up at Claire. Her face paled. "It's not what you think," she whispered. Anthony clutched the phone in his hand, barely able to contain his rage. "Get out," he said, not raising his voice, but each syllable sounded like a hammer blow. "Get out of my house. Right now." Claire froze, her face first turning white and then blushing. Her gaze darted between Anthony and the phone, which he still clutched in his hand, as if it were an irrefutable verdict. "Anthony, please?" she began, her voice trembling, but he interrupted her, raising his voice sharply. "You heard what I said. Pack your things and leave. Right now." She took a step back as if his words had hit her. Her lips were trembling and there were tears in her eyes. "You won't even listen to me?" she said softly, almost in a whisper. "It doesn't mean anything. It was just a correspondence." "Stop it, Claire." Anthony threw the phone onto the nearest surface, the sound of impact reverberating through the room. "I've seen enough. Do you think I'm a fool? Doesn't that mean anything? Messages, laughter, touching, do you call all this nonsense?" She looked away, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her guilt had become too heavy. "It was a mistake," she said. "Things have gone further than they should have. I didn't mean to." Her voice trembled and tears began to roll down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Anthony laughed. It was a bitter, harsh laugh that had nothing to do with mirth. "You didn't want to hurt me?" He took a step closer to her, his voice quieter, but that only made it more threatening. "You must be kidding. You lied to me. You humiliated me with my best friend. And now you're standing here crying and waiting for me to feel sorry for you?" Claire didn't answer. Her hands were shaking as she ran her fingers through her hair, as if trying to put her thoughts in order. "Okay, fine," she said. "If that's what you want, I'll leave." "But Anthony." She took a step towards him, her eyes glistening with tears. "We can fix this. We can talk. Think about it. It's not the end. This is the end," he interrupted. His words sounded like an icy blow. "The end of what I thought was our life. The end of my trust in you, Claire. Nick is your choice, not mine." She turned away, her shoulders shaking. She stood motionless for a few moments, then, without saying a word, headed for the stairs. Anthony stayed downstairs, he could hear her packing upstairs. Every sound of the suitcase closing, every step echoed in his chest. 10 minutes later, she came downstairs with a small suitcase in one hand and a bag in the other. She stopped at the door, her face pale and her eyes red. "I know you're hurting," she said, her voice hoarse. "But I still love you. no matter what. Anthony clenched his fists, fighting the urge to respond. Her words sounded like mockery. Love? How can you talk about love when everything they had been building for 7 years was destroyed so meanly? Go away, Claire, he said finally. And don't come back. She stared at him for a moment as if hoping he would change his mind, but his expression left no doubt. Finally, she turned around, opened the door, and walked out without looking back. When the door slammed shut, silence filled the house. Anthony stood there, his breathing heavy and his head in chaos. Everything that had been said, everything that had happened, was spinning in his mind like an endless cycle. He walked over to the phone, which was still on the table, and picked it up. His gaze fell on the screen where the messages were still open. He flipped through them and every line of the text pierced through him. He threw the phone back on the table, sighed heavily, and went into the kitchen. He needed something to calm the storm in his head. Opening the cupboard, he took out a bottle of whiskey and poured himself half a glass. After taking a long drink, he felt the hot liquid burning his throat, but it did not bring relief. The whole house seemed empty. The silence was almost deafening and the air was heavy. Anthony sat down on the sofa, staring at a single point on the wall. That night had changed everything and he knew there was no turning back. Anthony was sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the phone screen. Notifications from friends and colleagues came one after the other, but he did not pay attention to them. Claire's unlocked phone was still in front of him. There were words and phrases that left little room for doubt. The relationship between Nick and Claire had long since crossed the line of friendship. But Anthony wasn't thinking about Claire right now. He was thinking about Nick. About how his best friend was playing a double game. The way he smiled at him, shook his hand, and betrayed him at the same time. Anthony knew he couldn't just let it go. It was necessary to act. Anthony woke up early the next morning. He drank strong coffee, then got into his car and parked near Nick's house. Sitting at the wheel, he watched the windows, trying to remain unnoticed. The street was quiet, with only a few passers-by disturbing the peace. Anthony was patient. He knew that sooner or later Nick would show his true colors. About an hour later, Nick's door opened. He came out looking immaculate, freshly ironed shirt, expensive trousers, neatly styled hair. He looked around, then headed for his black sedan. Anthony, trying not to attract attention, started the engine and slowly followed. Nick drove confidently. His car glided through the streets of the city until he stopped at a small flower shop. Anthony parked in the distance, watching Nick go inside and come out a few minutes later with a large bouquet of red roses. Not for a wife, Anthony thought, since he knew that his wife was still on a business trip. He turned on his phone's camera and took the first picture. Nick, walking towards the car with flowers, looked like a typical lover preparing for a secret meeting. Nick's next destination turned out to be an elite restaurant in the city center. He parked the car, handed the keys to a young Jack guy and headed for the entrance with flowers in his hands. Anthony took out his phone again, photographing every move. A few minutes later, a tall woman in a tight-fitting dress emerged from the restaurant. She looked elegant and was clearly in the mood for a romantic evening. Nick handed her the flowers, she smiled and, slightly tilting her head, whispered something in his ear. Anthony gripped the phone so tightly that his fingers turned white. He shot a short video of their meeting, recording every gesture, every smile and touch. They went inside, leaving Anthony on the street, overcome by a mixture of anger and determination. For the next hour, Anthony sat in the car thinking about what to do next. He had already taken some photos and recorded a video, but he wanted more proof. He knew that for someone like Nick, this woman wasn't the only one. Perhaps this was not the first and not the last case. He needed something that would reveal the whole picture. After a while, Nick and his companion left the restaurant. They were laughing, her hand on his forearm. They reached Nick's car where he opened the door for her again, displaying ostentatious gallantry. Anthony continued filming, recording how they were leaving. The next day, Anthony took the next step. He came to Nick's house again, but this time he chose a more secluded place to observe. He had been monitoring his movements since morning. Nick went back to the flower shop, then to another restaurant where he met another woman, a young blonde with an open smile. This left no doubt. Nick had a whole chain of romantic relationships, each of which was carefully hidden. Anthony continued to collect evidence. For several days he followed Nick, recording his meetings with women. His camera was always ready, and every picture was just another piece of the puzzle. Pictures, videos, even voice recordings, all these became his weapons. On the evening of the third day, Anthony was sitting at his desk with his laptop open in front of him. He was going through the evidence folder, collecting everything into a single file. He wrote a short but meaningful letter to Nick's wife. I would not like to be the one who brings you this news, but I believe that you should know the truth. Nick leads a double life. Here's the evidence. I'm truly sorry. Anthony. He attached photos and videos to the letter. Everything he had seen in recent days was there. Anthony stared at the screen for a few seconds before pressing the send button. The letter was gone, and he leaned back in his chair, feeling the tension gradually give way to cold contentment. Now the truth was in the hands of someone who had a right to know it. Anthony was sitting in his dark living room, lit only by his laptop screen. After the letter containing all the evidence of Nick's betrayal went to his wife, he stared at the mail client window for a long time. The message sent was proudly glowing there. Conflicting feelings were bubbling inside him, from satisfaction to anxiety. What will happen next? The phone vibrated on the table. It was a number he didn't recognize. Anthony just stared at the screen for a while before answering. Anthony? The woman's voice was low and cold. This is Stephanie, Nick's wife. The words sounded like a thunderbolt. He knew this moment would come, but he didn't expect it to be so fast. Yes, Stephanie, it's me, he said, trying to keep his tone even. I got your letter. Her voice was trembling, but there was a hidden rage in it. And I just wanted to ask you one question. Why? Why did you decide to send this to me? I thought you and Nick were friends. Anthony was silent for a few seconds, choosing his words. Because you deserve to know the truth, he finally said. Nick ruined my life. I found out that he was sleeping with my wife. And now I see that he's destroying yours too. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Anthony could hear her breathing, heavy and labored. Thank you, she finally said, but her voice didn't sound grateful, but rather tired. You're right. I deserve to know. But now I do not know what to do about it. Anthony continued to follow the developments the next day. He knew that his actions would have consequences, and he was right. In the evening, he received another message from Stephanie. This time, she asked him to meet in person. They met in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. She looked tired, but she still carried herself with dignity. Thanks for coming, she said when Anthony sat down across from her. I thought it was important, he replied. Stephanie opened her bag and took out papers that Anthony immediately recognized. They were printed photos and messages that he had sent her. You left me no choice, she said, tapping her fingers on the stack. I went to a lawyer. Nick doesn't even know I'm doing this. Anthony nodded, feeling a weight rise inside him. That's right. He deserves the truth to come out. Stephanie frowned. Anthony, I don't want this to be revenge. I want it to be fair. But you have to understand that this will ruin not only his life but also a lot of things in mine. He wanted to say that she was better off without Nick, but he restrained himself. Instead, he just said, sometimes the truth destroys, but it also liberates. Events began to develop rapidly. A few days later, Stephanie's lawyer officially filed for divorce. Nick was stunned. He obviously did not expect that his double life would become known, and even more so that it would lead to such consequences. Anthony heard about it from a mutual friend. Nick tried to hush up the case, offered apologies, even gifts to make amends to Stephanie, but she was adamant. The divorce papers were signed 2 weeks later. Anthony felt strangely relieved as he watched Nick's life crumble. But with this relief came a bitter realization. His own life had also been destroyed. The house where he lived with Claire seemed like an empty shell to him now. The decision to sell it came suddenly, but it was final. He hired a realtor, started packing his things and looking for a new apartment. Every step on the way to a new beginning was painful but necessary. Against the background of Nick's divorce, his own separation from Claire began to seem like something inevitable, something that was going to happen. On the day Anthony left the house, he stopped on the threshold, looked at the walls that once held happy memories. He took a deep breath and stepped out the door. He moved into the apartment. It was a completely different place, having nothing to do with his old home. The spacious living room, white walls and high ceilings created a sense of freedom. It was a feeling Anthony hadn't felt in a long time. He was sitting on the floor among the boxes, slowly sorting through his things. Each of them was a part of his past, but he decided to keep only what mattered to him. Books, travel photos, old magazines, all this took its place on the shelves and in the drawers. Everything else, including things that reminded him of Claire, he had thrown away before moving in. It was his way of putting the past behind him. A few days later, Anthony began exploring his new neighborhood. He found a cozy cafe on the corner, where the barista had already memorized his order, a strong Americano with a drop of milk. One day while walking, the phone in his pocket vibrated. A message from Stephanie appeared on the screen. Are you free tonight? Can we have some coffee? Stephanie. Their meetings began to happen more often. After they first talked in the cafe, they gradually started to keep in touch. Her company was unexpectedly comfortable. There was no tension in her, only calm sincerity. Anthony quickly replied, "Of course. Where can I meet you?" She suggested a small cafe in the city center, famous for its desserts. Anthony smiled, sent a confirmation and headed there. Stephanie was already waiting for him at a table by the window when he entered. She waved her hand at him, her face lit up with a warm smile. She looked relaxed today in jeans, a light sweater, and her hair was pulled back in a casual bun. "Good to see you," Anthony said, sitting down across from her. "How are you?" "It's a little better today," she admitted, straightening a lock of hair that had escaped from her hairstyle. "I'm getting used to being alone." "And you?" He smiled, sipping his coffee. "Moving helped. It's like starting over from scratch." Conversations with Stephanie have always been easy, but today there is a different energy between them. They discussed books, movies, even trips they would like to make. Every time she laughed, Anthony noticed her eyes twinkle slightly. When the evening came to an end, they left the cafe together. The city street was flooded with soft light, and Anthony felt his hand accidentally touch it. He wanted to apologize, but she didn't pull away. Instead, they held hands and walked on, silently enjoying the moment. After a few weeks, their meetings became regular. They drank coffee, went to exhibitions, and walked in parks. Anthony began to notice how his emptiness, which Claire had left, was gradually being filled with something new, warm, and sincere. Stephanie was not only a good conversationalist, but also a person who understood his pain because she had been through it herself. One evening, when they were sitting on the couch in his apartment, discussing another movie, she suddenly asked, "Anthony, have you ever thought about starting over not alone?" He looked at her, her eyes glittering in the lamplight. He didn't answer right away, but he knew the question wasn't random. He felt that their bond had become deeper than just friendship. A few months after they met, Anthony made a decision. His new apartment was his refuge, but not his home. Stephanie became a real home. He packed up his things and moved in with her. They began to live together, creating their new lives far from the past, which now seemed like just a distant echo. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.